My name is Ben Beckman. This is Miles Redden, and we're going to be talking today about a field study that we've been working on for the past couple of years, looking at some of the effects of mob grazing at the Barta Brothers Ranch up there in the eastern Sandhills, fairly close to where Chad's been doing his grazing at. Jerry kind of covered some of this in the introduction, so we'll just go over it really briefly. But for our intents and purposes today, when we're talking about mob grazing or ultra-high stocking density, we usually consider that to be 200,000 pounds per acre type stocking densities, coupled with multiple moves per day. Whether that's 5 or however many Chad does, we do usually two times a day that we move. So we also figured we might touch briefly on when we're talking about stocking rate and stocking density. We still sometimes have a hard time figuring the two out. So stocking rate, when we're discussing what stocking rate is, that's animal consumption over a unit of land area over a given period of time. A lot of times you see that given in AUMs, animal unit months. You can also say 10 acres per pair over an entire year. That differs from stocking density. Stocking density is an instantaneous measurement where we're talking about live animal weight per unit area, so that 2,000 pounds per acre. Increasing stocking density does not necessarily mean that you're increasing stocking rate. So to kind of illustrate that here, we've got 10 steers, and we're grazing them on the same landmass. If you can imagine, those little dots are steers. We couldn't find really tiny cow pictures to paste on there, so you'll have to use your imagination a little bit. But we have 10 steers. They're covering the same amount of area in that 27 days that we have them grazing this. However, the steers over here are a low stocking density. They're able to have that entire area for those 27 days, and they're going to spread out, they're going to disperse out over that area while they're grazing. For a higher stocking density, we're confining them into those small paddocks. We're causing them to really not selectively graze anymore. That mob mentality that we were talking about earlier with Chad, we're still covering the same area over that period of time with the same number of animals, so we have the same stocking rate, but we have two different stocking densities. And if you kind of visually picture that up on the top there, we've got a low stocking density. The animals are really spread out. Down below, high stocking density, where those animals are going to be really tightly compacted together.
So again, some of what Jerry went over earlier today, some of the claims we hear surrounding mob grazing from a lot of the practitioners who use mob grazing, that it builds soil, increases soil organic matter, increasing soil fertility, and as a result it increases pasture productivity. They can grow more grass, they can increase their stocking rate. Like Chad said, he's 2.5 times higher stocking rate, and we hear that all the time. I had never heard 8 before. That's pretty crazy, but we hear 2 to 3. That's pretty normal from what we hear from mob producers. An increase in species diversity, particularly native species. They seem to make a comeback in a lot of mob grazing systems. You get more uniform distribution of your urine and fecal matter, and then increased animal production per acre because you're utilizing more forage. You can grow more pounds of beef per acre. Oh, there we go. So most practitioners who take on mob grazing, it's been our experience, they have one of two goals: either to achieve relatively high levels of trampling and really incorporate a lot of vegetation into the soil to boost that soil organic matter and boost their fertility and vegetation production, or to achieve really high rates of harvest efficiency so that they're utilizing more of the available vegetation, putting more of that vegetation into their animals. So, working on this at the Barta Ranch. The Barta Ranch is about a 5,400 acre ranch. We have about 250 acres of sub-irrigated meadow there, the Sandhills sub-irrigated meadow. About 120 of that is one contiguous ranch. The rest is split up throughout the ranch. It was donated to UNL in '96 by Jim and Clifford Barta. A couple old bachelor brothers had no one to leave their ranch to, so they gave it to the university, wanted it to be used for research and as a model ranch. So it's located just a little bit west of Rose, Nebraska, kind of over here on the eastern edge of the Sandhills where you see the star. And typically receives about 22 inches of annual precip. About 75% of that falls during the growing season. That's kind of where we're at. Our mob grazing, again, is on this sub-irrigated meadow. Pretty typical. If any of you have ever seen Sandhills meadows, there are some variation there, but a lot of them look like this. They're wide, flat meadows. We have really high vegetation production, 4,000 to 5,000 pounds per acre. Water table's quite high, well within the rooting zone in most years, unless it's 2012 or a similar year. Our meadows dominated by mostly introduced cool season grasses. A lot of red top, timothy, quackgrass, and along with some bluegrass and reed canary. Quite a few sedges and rushes. We also do have some warm season natives out there that we've seen beginning to increase over the last few years. And a good population of introduced forbs as well.
All right, so the study that Miles and I are working on is actually a part of a longer term study that began in 2010. Jordan Johnson was the master's student who kind of implemented this study. And he started out by looking at the grazing system effects on forage utilization and harvest efficiency. Miles kind of has taken over that side of the project and continued looking at that and some different aspects we'll talk about later today. We won't go into my side of the project too much today, but I've been looking at litter decomposition rates and root response, annual root growth, to see what effects these different grazing strategies that we've been implementing have on those two factors. So the objectives for the study that we set up were to see what effects that mob grazing has on net primary production, both above ground and below ground, to see what the forage utilization is. We've been talking about trampling, consumption, see exactly how those play out when we have different grazing strategies, animal performance, and again, like I said, litter decomposition. We decided to put that mob grazing model up against a 4-pasture rotational system. Two different ones of those, we'll explain those here in just a little bit. Hay treatment, which is the traditional use of a cool season meadow. Those sub-irrigated meadows have traditionally been used for hay production, and an ungrazed control. So this is a picture of our study site there. You can see we've got our large mob meadows. We have 4-pasture rotations here, and then our control and hay treatments. They might vary in size a little bit, but we have a uniform stocking rate across all of our grazing treatments of 3 AUMs per acre. So the only thing that we're changing amongst those different size or those different grazing regimes is the stocking densities and timing and method of grazing. This always gets brought up, so we thought we'd kind of talk about it right off the bat here. How we went about doing our mob grazing. We have a system similar, I guess, to Chad's. We don't have a fancy tractor to pull our tank around. We have to do it all manually. But we have a 100-gallon plastic water tank with a float valve that we use. We have black poly pipe that we get to drag around with that. We have had some issues in the past since that poly pipe is on top of the ground. It can really heat up in the sun. So we put a Y splitter onto those tanks and made sure that we have a continual flow to make sure that we have cool water at all times in those tanks. We just use a solar fence charger. I think we have a stay fix, but kind of the hotter the better. Once, like Chad said, though, once they learn to respect that, it's usually pretty good. It's just the initial getting them to know that the fence is there. Having a little bit of a zap there works to help train them a little faster. And then we just use a trace mineral block for a mineral supplement. When the project was initially set up, there was collaboration done with Terry Gompert of how exactly do we want to go about setting up mob grazing. There's many different people that practice mob grazing, and each one does it differently. So how do we want to set up something that can be agreed upon by most practitioners as, okay, they're doing mob grazing? We decided that we were going to focus on the soil building side of aspects, and in collaboration with Terry, we decided that 60% trampling was kind of the number that we wanted to shoot for in order to have enough trampling to increase the soils, to build up that organic matter in the soils, and increase our production. That was the goal that we were shooting for when we developed this study. So keep that in mind as we're going through this and we're describing some things. We're shooting for trampling. That was our primary goal in this mob grazing.
So for our mob treatment, as we've mentioned a little bit before, we have 200,000 pound per acre stocking density, which is really kind of the bottom end of mob grazing. Some people will mob a little lower than that, 100 to 50,000 pounds, but most people who use the really high stocking densities, they consider this kind of the bottom end of mob grazing. On our meadow, this equates to a 2 move per day. In our mob treatments, we have a 60-day grazing season beginning in early June. That's a lot later than you would typically start grazing these meadows, but the reason for that is, as Ben just covered, we were trying to get trampling. This way we had a good crop of vegetation standing on the meadow when the grazing started, so there was enough vegetation there for them to trample as much as 60% of it and not starve to death. That was the goal. So that's why we have that late start date. There we are. One of the first of our 4 pasture treatments is a 4 pasture once over, is what we call it. It's about 6,000 pound per acre stocking density. It's just a simple 4 pasture rotation, 60-day grazing season that matches with the mob season. They start at the same time and end the same time as the mob grazers. They spend 15 days in each pasture, and that's it. That's just a really simple 4 pasture rotation. Our second 4 pasture treatment is a 4 pasture twice over. Lower stocking density by just a little bit. And these pastures are grazed twice in each growing season for 10 days each. We start this treatment earlier in the spring, about mid-May, so it's about 20 days longer than the mob or the once over, but it ends about the same time in early August. And we did this because it's a little more representative of how most people graze in the Sandhills. They're usually out on grass mid-May. They want to take advantage of that early spring growth, and then the twice over kind of helps keep the vegetation in a more palatable stage for these steers as they graze through the summer. A little bit more on our mob grazing. It's very similar, as Ben said, to the way Chad does it. We have our long alleyways are about 100 yards wide, and then we split them down into about 20-foot strips with these electric poly tape on reels hanging off of our permanent electric fence here on the sides. We move twice a day, moves at 7 and 2 typically, and that's kind of how we mob. This is a short video we managed to put together. Jerry here actually provided us with some time-lapse cameras last year, so we set them up, and there's one frame every 10 minutes for a full day from about 6:30 or so in the morning, about 7 I guess, about 7 in the morning through till dark of this day. This is a 2-day move, so they're just coming into this strip right here for the morning. We move the water tank up with them, and then about midday we pull that center fence, we set it up out in front where they'll be for the next move, and or the move the next morning. And that's a pretty typical day for our mob steers. It's a lot of movement, a lot of motion, a lot of get off of there, lots of trampling. So our mob grazing gives us, as you can see in the video probably, a really uniform utilization. And our goal was 60% trampling, but there's just not much left back here. It kind of looks like it was a swath or run over it. It's all pretty well, it's either grazed or it's on the ground, one of the two. They do, yes, ma'am. They never would do it when I was down there with a camera, but we have the ones that get down on their knees and crawl until they feel that tape touch their backs, and then they kind of arch their backs and get about 3 more inches. They'll go as far as they can under the fence. Yeah, you can see it real clear right there. So, and then our 4 pastures, especially our twice overs, we get a lot more of this patchy utilization. You can see kind of around the cage there and about where those steers are standing, it's pretty grazed down, but then over here you've got a lot of the high grazing. Chad? You bet. We're between, let's see here, this was actually a 2012 picture, and in 2012 we did not get 60% trampling. We had a little bit lower production. But even this year we had more trampling, but it still looks about this utilized. Like it's either, there's nothing out there taller than that typically. It's either on the ground or trampled. So, any other questions? Okay. Yes. Well, it was worst drought we've had in, what, 80 years, something like that. So, yeah, it was really low rainfall. The water table fell far enough that the grass couldn't utilize it as well, so we had a much lower productivity compared to the previous 2 years on the meadow in 2012. So.
You might also comment on, of course, our paddocks here are pretty long, narrow
right.
Rectangles versus what Chad said about the square.
Right.
So what do you observe in terms of the cattle in handling that?
Well, I thought a lot of it in that that time-lapse video, you know, every 10 minutes, like I said, there's a frame every 10 minutes, and it's like they're here, 10 minutes later they're down there, 10 minutes later they're back here, and it's just like that just about all day long. I mean, it's like watching a ping pong ball in that those long narrow strips. They do a lot of moving. Anna? I think it's a lot because of the shape, especially in the morning strip where we turn them in. They come in and they're all crammed up in this end where we close the gate up behind them, and they're hungry, they're wanting to eat, so they're moving pretty quickly down through it. And then, you know, for the steer in the back to get the next bite, he's got to walk around everybody to get to the front to settle down, and they just kind of leapfrog all day long down to one end and then leapfrog back. We saw a lot of that type of movement. So, and then, yeah, so 4 pastures, we get these kind of these grazing lawns established in their first, especially in the twice over, their first time through, they set up these grazing lawns. And then in their second occupation, they just kind of sit on those. They don't really hit any of this tall stuff they didn't get the first time around. So.
Okay, so we had to come up with some different ways to actually measure what we were seeing on our study. So what we ended up doing was kind of a combination of some different things, but a lot of it involved sitting down on the ground with a pair of clippers and cutting grass off from the ground level. So how we, I guess, figured out, especially our production, our utilization, and trampling, we went out and we would put out 10 quarter-meter squared quadrats, so just kind of like a frame, rectangular frame, and place those on the ground and clip everything within that frame before the cattle came through with the mob grazing, and then after they had gone through, and we would sort that then. Before they grazed, we sorted it into standing live, anything that was growing from this season's growth, standing dead, anything that had been left over from the last season, and then we raked up any litter until we got to the soil surface. Once the cattle had gone through and grazed that area, we came back right next to where we'd clipped and clipped again. Sorting this time, we again had standing dead, so anything that was still pretty much straight up that the cattle had passed over or hadn't fully utilized. Again, standing dead, there wasn't much of that left normally. Again, we raked up any litter that was on the ground, including any new litter that they might have, or usually an old litter, and then trampled. I guess we raked up the old litter, and then we had what we considered a new category, trampled. Anything that was this year's growth that was either on the ground or bent greater than 45 degrees. Jordan Johnson, previous 2 summers that he was out there, did some work figuring out exactly once that grass plant has been, bent off, how far does it have to be leaned over before it says I can't grow. The xylem and stuff has been destroyed enough that that plant has to start totally over. So we clipped that stuff, put it in brown paper bags, dried it, and weighed it. We also, so that's how we did it in the mob. Yeah, Chad.
What did you come up with for the angle?
What, that 45 degrees.
45
Yes.
degrees.
That's what Jordan came up with, yeah. So we did that in the mob. We could just go out, clip beforehand, clip afterhand, because we had like one day. Grass won't grow enough, within this setting in one day to really throw off our clipping data there. When we were talking about those 15-day occupations, though, we had to put up these grazing exclosures. You can see these cages. And if you're ever driving around in the Sandhills and you just happen to see a bunch of cages in someone's pasture, most likely someone from the university is there doing some research. But we would go through, place these cages randomly around a pasture, and then as soon as we moved out, we would clip inside the cage and clip outside the cage. So we had a unused and then after utilization to compare those two. We also left some of those cages up for the entire growing season and then clipped those at the end of the year to get overall biomass production. So what we saw exactly. For utilization, trampling, and consumption, utilization was lowest in the 4-pasture twice over treatments. That trampling was 2 to 3 times higher in the mob than either of the 4-pasture treatments, and harvest efficiency was lowest in the mob. So here's a graph to kind of explain that a little bit. On top we have percent trampled in the gray, percent disappearance. We're assuming most of that's consumption. That's after they'd gone through and grazed. We don't know where that part of the plant went, so we're pretty sure it's inside the cow, or I guess steer in this case. And all of that together we're calling utilization, because we either want it to be trampled into the ground or consumed. So across the board here we can see that that 4-pasture twice over has the lowest utilization. We're only getting a little bit above 60% utilization over the years that we've done this study. And again, we've got much higher amounts of trampling in that mob. That's kind of what we would expect to see and what we were when we set this up. Is there any, were they statistically different at all, Miles? I don't.
For our 4-pasture twice over, was statistically lower in total utilization, I believe. But total utilization, our 4-pasture once over, and our mob, the 2 treatments that we started in early June later in the season, they were not different. But except for the components of that utilization were different. That just like it says, like Ben was saying, the trampled is significantly higher in the mob, and then our disappearance looks quite a bit lower. So.
Did you guys see any shifts through that, say, 60-day season in terms of trapping versus disappearance?
As far as, no, not within a single year. I'm still working on compiling multiple years, but within any single year, it seems to be pretty uniform. I mean, they're using pretty much everything that's out there. So.
I think we're asking now through the season, you see lower trampling early in the season versus trampling late.
Right, not statistically lower. No, they seem to be pretty similar throughout the season, which was kind of surprising. Yes. Ooh. We're coming up on that here in just a minute. So yeah, it affects them quite a bit. We'll see here in just a second. For vegetation production, our total vegetation production, again, we used our fancy cages and just put about 10 of these through each replication of each treatment, and then at the end of the grazing season, when we were pretty well done, we had maximum. The forage was pretty well done growing. We'd just clipped inside these cages to estimate across the meadow. And in the fourth year, 2013, we had not yet seen any statistical differences in production between treatments. Here's our vegetation production by treatment. They're all pretty similar. Our control's a little lower, but each of our grazing treatments, they're all pretty similar. They're all within about 300 pounds per acre of production of one another. So
Is this 2013?
this is 12 and 13 together. So steer gains, your question. Our four pasture twice over gained a lot more than either the mob or the once over, by 2 to 3 times in each of the 3 years that we've gathered data on it. But there was no differences between the once over and the mob. So here we've got in red the 4 pasture once over, in black the 4 pasture 2 rotation treatment, and the gray is the mob. And then pounds per head average daily gain. So our once over and our mob are pretty poor. I mean, our once over, we got 7/10 about of a pound average daily gain for 60-day grazing season all 3 years. Our mob was really low in 2011. It's slowly climbing, but it's not been statistically different in any year yet. Our twice over, as you can see, is quite a bit better. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Right there. So. Right. We believe it's a result of the forage quality. As we looked at that picture earlier of the twice over pastures where they established their grazing lawns, when they come back into that on the second go round, they're pretty much just consuming regrowth. Whereas in this once over and twice over, or once over in the mob, pardon me, they are by mid-July. I mean, it's a cool season dominant meadow, so by mid-July their forage quality is pretty poor, and they can't go back and get the regrowth. That's a much higher quality. They've got to just stay on that low quality, poor nutrient value feed. These are, I'm sorry, this is 11, 12, and 13 here by year. Yes, sir. So even in 12, when we had the drought year, you know, our twice over numbers dropped off quite a bit, but they were still quite a bit higher, a bit better than the mob or the once over. And we're pretty sure it's a result of the regrowth late in the season and also getting an earlier start and taking advantage of that earlier, more nutritious feed in May. Anna. Possibly. It hasn't, like, it looks pretty significant because this is on a pretty small scale, but really what we've managed to do is increase from 0.3 of a pound to 0.5 of a pound. I mean, I don't know many producers who'd be willing to take 0.3 of a pound a day gain on their yearlings. You know, it looks, but it's not a significant, it has not been a significant gain. They're still about 0.5 pound per day or less. So that's the hope.
Percentage-wise, it's pretty
Yeah,
good.
yeah. So, any other questions? All right. So, something we've been hearing a lot more about in the last few years are the really high densities. I think the highest one I've heard is 3 million. I don't remember even where I heard that, but somebody was saying 3 million pounds per acre. So we wanted to look into what the effect was of a variety of these ultra-high stocking densities on the same things we were looking at before: utilization, our trampling, and our harvest efficiency. And we thought that increasing our stocking density would increase our harvest efficiency and decrease our trampling percentage. So that's how we set this project up. This is just a 4-day sub-study that we repeated twice in the summer of 2012 and then again twice in the summer of 2013, where our treatments were 100, 200, 400, and 800,000 pounds per acre. Our typical treatment is the 200,000 pound per acre 2-day moves. So to get these other stocking densities, we just either doubled the area that they had available to them in a given pasture to get 100,000 pounds, or cut it in half to double our stocking rate to 400,000, and cut that in half again to 800,000. Here's kind of a brief example of how we did it. This again, there's 200,000 here in the middle, or this second one up rather. This is our typical treatment, and so to double our stocking rate, we cut each of those strips in half. To quadruple the stocking rate, we cut each of those in half again. Density, pardon me. Yes, like Ben was saying, we still get these screwed up all the time. Yes, our stocking density. And so this was our 4-day, and it was just 1 day at 100, 200, 400, and 800. 1 day each for those. What we found was that on our meadow in this treatment in 2012 and 2013, we could not detect any difference in the percent of vegetation that was trampled or the percent of vegetation that was harvested between 100 and 800,000 pounds per acre. These are our numbers. They're all pretty similar. There's a couple of percentage points difference in some of them, but not very much. Our trampling was between 36 and 39%, all within about 3% of each other. Within between 100 and 800,000, and then our disappearance was within about 6 percentage points, regardless of the density, from 100 to 800,000 pounds per acre, which was really counterintuitive. It was not what we expected to see at all. So,
Miles?
yes.
Yeah. So if you figure there how much disappeared, so that was all considered.
Right.
How would that calculate out in terms of body weight?
In 2012 and 13, we were up around, I've got it on pounds. It was about 2%, 2 to 2.5%. In 2011, it was a bit lower. We were down to about 12 pounds per head disappearance average on a daily basis, but it is about around 2%, 2 to 2.5. So anyway, for our conclusions for the project overall, in the 4th year of mob grazing, we've not yet seen a significant increase in productivity. We have seen an increase in warm seasons in our meadow. Visually, they're coming back. They're beginning to move back into the meadow. Hope that trend continues, but we haven't seen an increase in productivity per acre in the mob compared to either of the 4 pasture grazing systems. The mob has given us a decreased harvest efficiency compared to the 4 pasture grazing systems. And over that 60-day grazing season, either one of those treatments has a pretty significantly reduced animal performance with that late start in June. And from the sub-study, it appears that increasing our stocking density over 100,000 pounds per acre has not changed our harvest efficiency or our utilization or trampling. So, any questions? Yes.
So if you ran this over a period of 60 days, that was good, still with the long range, you would have had like that regrowth in the meadow for later use, right? So if you only do it, I mean, I understand what you did with this model, but if you look at it in annual production on your ranch, you actually might get a higher production.
Right. Well, let's see here. Well, there is regrowth behind, like obviously where we started by the end of the season. We've got a pretty significant amount of regrowth there. The way that we sample our net primary production is that we figure the effects of mob grazing. If it's going to lead to an increase in total production on the ranch of this meadow, we should be able to see that the following year. Like if we mob graze it this year, we should see a boost in production the following year. So that's really how we've been sampling our total production, rather than going within year. This spot got X amount of regrowth, because the regrowth is going to vary depending on where you were at a certain time. So how do you calculate? Do you calculate it just where you started at the beginning of the season, because that's where you have the most regrowth, or do you, how do you do that? So for production sampling, we've done it. We just sample our production on an area that has not been grazed this year to sample the effect of last year's grazing. And then that spot, where those cages are located, moves every year, so that we're always sampling last year's grazing. So when we clipped in 2013, we were actually sampling the effects of 2010, 11, and 12's grazing. And so there wasn't any regrowth included in that in the mob treatment or in the once over. Does that make sense? Okay. And so that's kind of how we're looking at it, because it was the only way we could standardize it and know that it's the same for all of the treatments. So. Anna.
Sure. I don't have anything to really say on litter decomposition rates yet. We're still kind of working on those. But I have done some stuff. Like I said, we were looking at root production, because if your grass is healthier, if you are producing more, you should see that below ground as well as above ground. And so far, we haven't been able to see a difference across grazing treatments in root production within those 2 years. We're still working on a few things, because the real issue with that is there's a huge difference in root production in this spot. Even though the meadow looks fairly uniform, you go out there and you get this tiny little swale that somehow the moisture regimes change there and the soils change there, and root production might vary hugely within 10-20 feet within one pasture. So there's a lot of variation that I'm seeing there, so we haven't been able to tease out any differences between the treatments right now. So we haven't seen anything yet. There might be something there might not, if we can look at it a little bit better and closer.
Miles, you might comment on the shape. I know you don't have any results of data here, but just about what you did. I mean, you think it's kind of important. Chad mentioned that shape of our pattern.
So when I started on this project in 2012, spring of 2012, and was looking at the results and some of the stuff that we had from 10 and 11, I wondered what would happen if we could change the pasture shape. And I didn't include it in here because we only have 1 year's worth of data. And with that, statistically, there weren't any differences because our errors were really high. I'm hoping that with a couple more years of data, we could see some difference. But what we did was we replicated this 200,000 pounds per acre, same number of moves per day in square pastures. The difference between those square pastures and the long rectangular pastures this year were not statistically different. Numerically, there was slightly lower trampling in the square pastures and a little bit higher utilization in the square pastures, but it wasn't enough to statistically be able to say that there is a huge difference. But it was a fun project to do, and I think it personally, I think that it's got to have a different. It's got to make a difference. It's got to have an effect. If you can eliminate that leapfrog effect, the challenge is proving that it does or proving that it doesn't. So, yes, sir.
So was the control not grazed at all, or was
The control was not grazed. Has had no impact on it at all. So.
Intake by percent body weight is pretty low. Again, the primary purpose for our study was to learn if with mob grazing could we get fairly rapid and dramatic increases in changes in cell composition and cell organic. So we're not taking a system like Chad is developing just to see what the harvest efficiency is. By definition, we have pretty low harvest efficiencies because we're trying to get as much back as possible. We're asking that question about again mob grazing how quickly it affects soil. So build soil. So far we haven't seen much
Are there other questions for Miles or Ben? Yes, Jack.
Back to the games, I just couldn't remember how much earlier you started
The twice over starts about mid-May, May 15th, May 20th, and it's about 2 weeks to 20 days ahead of the mob.
so you don't know how much they gained that first.
No, that's one thing that I wish we could get, but we haven't had the ability to get. The steers are weighed out of the feedlot and then weighed when they get back to the feedlot, and so we haven't had the ability to weigh them during the season and kind of map their gains and see when they're gaining what.
I know that's a good time. I mean, I had a little wake-up call this year. Normally I send a bunch of steers to Montana mid-May. They had rain up there and couldn't get them in. Ended up being good camp. Those steers, when I shipped them out there, were 100 pounds heavier than the year before. Just that. I'm not saying that that's all. I'd like to imagine, but I know a bunch of it was. But that's a very tight situation. So those gain numbers could really speed up just by those 2 weeks.
Yeah, that's another thing we haven't got the data on yet, but these steers we pull off this meadow, we send them to the feedlot, and we follow them through the feedlot to slaughter to see if these, if the low gains on our other treatments are made up through compensatory gain in the feedlot, and so far they haven't been completely. There's some compensatory gain, but not enough to really make up for what they didn't gain over the summer. So.